Hi everyone, another unusual camera angle today. Welcome to another Richard Layman review in the series, and we're at book number 32 on this list today. And yeah, it's been a bit of a weird one this, because I've done a lot of thinking about what book to put at number 32, because we're at a point in this collection where the books are bad but not necessarily terrible. And there were really two books that were fighting for contention here. What obviously one's at 31, one's at 32, so we're still splitting hairs with the position of them. But I've chosen to put The Lake at number 32 on this list. This is a really, really weird one. The Lake was released in 2004, and it was the penultimate book that we would get by Richard Layman. Layman died in 2001, but there were several books released after his death, The Lake being second from last. And when I first read The Lake, I enjoyed it a lot more than when I revisited it. I was still quite early in my rereading of Layman books, and this was a first time read for me. And there was a part of it that I was quite happy to read, being a big fan of, Layman's style and finding a book that I'd never previously read. But coming back to it after all the other books, there's a definite sense of something's not quite right with this. Now, the thing with The Lake, as with many of the other books released at this point in time, is that I question how much of this did Richard Layman actually write, being as this was released 3 years after his death, and is it a decent story? And there are some positive things I want to say about The Lake first and foremost. I think the main villain here is quite interesting in that, although it is very obvious very early on who the main villain is, it's still an interesting villain in that he's a lot more three-dimensional than the usual Layman villain. He's got a charisma and a charm. He's intelligent. He's cunning. He plots. He has a reason for doing what he's doing, but he's very sly and manipulative. He's not just the sort of one-dimensional Layman villain, so he's quite deep. And Layman wrote quite a few villains like this around a similar point in time between the mid-80s and early 90s. There's a couple of villains that I'll mention that were more than just your one-dimensional Layman villain. It's a bit of a shame that he's quite obvious as to the fact that he's a villain very early on. I'm not quite sure why Layman gave that away, because there's other characters, one in The Stake, one in... what's it called? There's a crime book he wrote. I'll get to it when I get to it. I haven't reviewed it yet. And a few others where we've got villains that are not necessarily easy to guess, but this one is, which is a bit of a shame. And the story is quite interesting in that it's about the past mirroring the future. We've got a lot of scenes set in the 60s and other scenes set in the 80s. And I liked all that. And it is a fast-paced and interesting story. This has got some unintentionally hilarious moments. There's a bit in which a guy falls through the floorboard of an abandoned house after sex. It's meant to be tragic, but it comes across as very funny. It's really quite silly in how it happens. And we've got something that happens near the end of the story that kind of mirrors that. And I like that about the book. It's resolved well, and it's well structured. But the problem I've got is almost everything else. First and foremost, it doesn't feel like Layman wrote this book, or at least the majority of this. I feel like this was a sketch that Layman did, or maybe a short story, or something he'd been working on, because his style's there, and the concept of it is definitely something that Layman would have wrote. But the actual dialogue, the structure, the language and wording here isn't like anything else that I've seen in a Layman work. There's elements of the dialogue in particular that have the sort of Layman flavour, that they're very short and simple, but words are said that Layman would never use. Some of the sex scenes have got phrases and things used that Layman has never used in any of his other books. And I can't categorically say that Layman didn't write that, but it's quite unusual that Layman would do something for one particular book there's a certain style that he has, and it's not in this book. It feels like, I get the feeling, particularly considering some of this book was set in the 60s and some of it's set in the 80s, that Lehman probably wrote the bulk of this story at some point in the mid 80s. I feel like it was either a rejected novel that he was working on, or something that he put aside for a later time, or something that he never completed and simply just never went back to. And what feels like's happened is either somebody from the publishers or the estate has gone to this, decided that it needed fattening up and tidying up, and has rewritten certain elements, has completed lines of dialogue, has updated it in certain ways, and then it's been published as a novel. Because there's a lot of really odd things here. Not only the fact that it's predominantly set between the 60s and 80s, and I've got no understanding as to why Lehman in 2004, the Lehman estate would have released a book in 2004 that he wrote towards the end of his career that was set in the 80s. That wouldn't have made any sense unless it was. I mean, he did it with the Travelling Vampire show, which is set in the 60s, but it just feels a bit weird. But maybe that's not the case. But the fact that there are certain things here, like for example, you've got references to things like Johnny Depp being referenced as a heartthrob. And another reviews channel has already mentioned, he would have been usurped at this point by maybe Leonardo DiCaprio. Johnny Depp was a heartthrob predominantly maybe in the 90s, maybe the late 80s even. But then there's references, and there's lots of references to things in the 80s. The story's set in the 80s, but then it references things like sort of movies that hadn't come out until the early 90s. And even things like mobile phones. At one bit, there's reference to mobile phones, and they disappear, which weren't around really, in the 80s. And I just get the feeling that this is a story that Lehman wrote in the 80s that has kind of been repackaged and put together by somebody else who hasn't really taken the time to understand the setting and has added things at a more modern point. Maybe this has got. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but maybe this is a story that Lehman kind of wrote in the 80s and then revisited in the 90s without correcting those things it did in the 80s, which would explain why it was rejected in the first place. And then the estates kind of just added more lines of dialogue to it. But at any rate, it's basically like an 80s slasher where a woman who she fell in love with somebody. They died during a tragic accident. She found herself pregnant. She gives birth. 20 years later, her daughter's boyfriend has a similar tragedy. They find themselves stalked by a character, and then the main nefarious villain of the plot reveals themselves and why they're doing all this. It's not a bad story in terms of structure and plotting. I didn't mind it at all. I actually it feels very reminiscent of an 80s slasher film. And it's, like I say, it's got an interesting villain, and the story is quite well constructed and set. But the dialogue and the phrasing takes me right out in terms of the fact that it just doesn't feel like anything Lehman would have wrote. I'm not going to use specific examples. But if you've read a few Lehman books, you'll know that this doesn't feel like Lehman in terms of how it's written. It's also got a lot of weird padding things. There's a bit with this psychotic chef who's stalking the characters, and at one point he finds himself assaulted by trolls under a bridge. There's another bit in which the main daughter, who for some reason is incredibly stupid, goes out running and gets herself captured by these deranged old people that are led by this transvestite character, and it's nothing to do with the main story. It's just thrown in there and just feels incredibly strange how it's just in the story for no reason. There's a revelation about the girlfriend, the daughter's new boyfriend, because she literally, her boyfriend dies, and within the space of a couple of days she meets somebody else. There's at one point she's grieving over her boyfriend, saying how she'll never love again. And the next thing, she's fallen in love with the first guy she's met on a midnight run, which is just bizarre. But anyway, his sister, the revelation about her is it's just weird. It's weird how it connects to the story, but it's just really, really strange. But it's an odd one, because I like the story, I like the structure of it, I like the flow of it, I like the villain. It's quite tidy in that sense, and I like the idea of it, but it's also it's got all this weird padding in that feels like it was just from some other story and thrown in for no real reason. The characters are particularly stupid. There's a moment here where the mother is told she's told that there's somebody after them. Won't reveal who, but she's then told that there's a problem at work. So she decides to tell her daughter to stay home while she goes to investigate this thing, leaving her daughter in mortal danger. Why? It's bizarre. It's totally out of character. And then when she gets home, she's having a shower. Instead of like thinking I've got to find my daughter, it's just like carrying on as if nothing's happened. Really strange. But yeah, like I said, the dialogue's what really throws me out, and some of the scenes. It's almost like someone trying to ape what Layman would have wrote, but not how Layman would have wrote it, and it just is very, very jarring. And on top of that, I mean, that's not enough for me to set this down. But on top of this, after you've read it and you go back to it again, I just found that it wasn't massively exciting or thrilling or anything particularly special. I don't hate it. It's not an awful book, but it's at this point in the list where I've gone past the awful books now, but it's still not a very good book. It's certainly not a book that I would recommend, as your first Layman book. And I think if you've read a few, you're probably going to find this a bit jarring. I appreciate the fact it exists, but I'm not really sure of whether it should. It doesn't feel like something that was complete by Layman himself. And there's something a bit weird about it compared to all of Layman's other stories. But it's certainly better than the books I've mentioned before. And like I say, I don't think it's an awful book. I just think it's a bit of a jarring and weirdly constructed sort of oddity that exists at the tail end of Layman's career. So that's The Lake at number 32 on my list.